When I was about 15 or 16, my family lived in a small, isolated house deep in the forests of Maine. We didn't stay there long. It was remote, far from any town, and just a little too quiet for comfort. But there's one night that still haunts me, something that happened a few days after New Year's. My cousin Ethan was staying over, and since school was still out, we planned to spend the night doing what we always did, playing video games and watching movies. The snowstorm outside was brutal, piling up inches by the minute, but inside we were warm, wrapped in blankets on the living room floor. We were about halfway through some movie, don't even remember what it was, when I noticed Ethan kept looking out the window. At first I thought nothing of it. Maybe he was watching the snowfall, mesmerized by how it looked under the dim porch light. But as the minutes dragged on, I realized something was off. He wasn't just watching the snow. He was focused, tense. His eyes would dart, then lock on something outside. I tried to ignore it, but I could feel my anxiety rising, an uneasiness settling in the pit of my stomach. Finally, I broke the silence. "What are you looking at?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He just kept staring. Then, without taking his eyes off the window, he said, "I think I saw something." That's when my heart sank. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but trees and snow, there shouldn't be anyone or anything moving out there. Especially not during a storm like this. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Ethan stayed glued to the window, barely blinking, while I sat there, my anxiety growing with every passing second. I kept asking him questions, trying to shake the tension in the room, but he just kept telling me to be quiet, his voice tense and hushed. The atmosphere in the house felt thick, like we were waiting for something to happen. I couldn't take my eyes off Ethan's face, watching his expression twist with unease. Then we saw it. A shadowy figure, barely visible through the swirling snow, darted between the trees about 200 feet from the house. We both jumped, our hearts pounding in sync. I tried to convince myself it was just the storm playing tricks on us, that maybe the snow or the wind had created an illusion, but deep down, I knew what I saw. It was a person, and they were out there, watching us. We stared, waiting for it to happen again, praying we had imagined it. But then, it did happen again. This time, further to the left, a second figure, darting from tree to tree, and then another, moving in the opposite direction. They were out there, more than one. Our panic grew with each sighting. The figures became more frequent, their movements erratic but deliberate. They would duck behind trees, peeking out just enough for us to catch glimpses before disappearing again. It was like some twisted game, them stalking us from the darkness. My pulse raced as we watched in silence, frozen in fear. Then one of them broke from the pattern. Instead of ducking behind another tree, the figure stepped out, fully visible now, standing still as if it wanted us to see. It was too far to make out any details, but it was clearly a person, motionless, staring directly at the house. And then without warning, it sprinted toward us. The sudden movement shattered the trance we were in. I bolted from the couch, my adrenaline surging, and ran straight upstairs to wake my dad. Ethan was right behind me, both of us shouting and stumbling over our words. My dad, groggy and confused, followed us downstairs. But by the time we reached the living room, the figures had vanished, swallowed by the storm. The empty landscape outside made it feel like we had imagined the whole thing. But the fear was still real, clawing at my insides. Ethan and I hurriedly explained to my dad what we had seen, expecting him to brush it off as an overactive imagination or some kind of misunderstanding. But to my surprise, he believed us. Maybe it was the panic in our voices or the way we couldn't stop shaking, but something convinced him that we weren't making this up. Without a word, he got up and checked all the doors and windows, making sure every possible entry point was locked. Then he grabbed his rifle from the closet and went outside to check the property. Ethan and I waited by the window, our eyes scanning the dark, snow-covered yard for any sign of movement. My heart was still pounding, the image of that figure sprinting toward us replaying over and over in my mind. But after what felt like an eternity, my dad came back inside. He hadn't found anything, no people, no tracks, just the empty yard and the howling wind. That night, my dad stayed with us in the living room, his rifle propped up against the wall beside him. Somehow, we managed to fall asleep, though I don't remember when or how. The fear never really went away. It just settled deep inside, mixing with exhaustion until my body couldn't stay awake any longer. By morning, the snowstorm had cleared, leaving a thick layer of white over everything. Ethan and I went outside to check the area in daylight, hoping maybe the snow had covered up any traces of what we had seen. But what we found made my blood run cold. Footprints, dozens of them. There were multiple sets, scattered near the tree line, all facing the house. They led to the exact spots where we had seen the figures darting between trees. Some of the prints circled around the house, close enough to touch the walls, and a few even overlapped with the tracks my dad had made the night before, meaning someone had been there asterisk after asterisk he went outside. But the worst part, the shed door was wide open. All our hunting knives, the ones we kept stored in there, were gone. Ethan and I stood there in stunned silence, staring at the open shed and the footprints. It felt unreal, like a nightmare we couldn't wake up from. When we told my dad, he just shook his head. He wasn't the type to call the cops. He had this belief that we should handle things ourselves, no matter how bad it got. And as unsettling as the discovery was, he didn't seem surprised, almost like he had been expecting something like this all along. We were already planning to move in 2 weeks, and thankfully, nothing else happened during that time. But the fear lingered, hanging over us like a shadow. Even now, I can't shake the memory of those figures, out there in the middle of the night, watching us from the trees. The snowstorm only added to the eerie silence, making it feel like we were completely alone, with no one to help if things went wrong. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if they'd managed to get inside. The thought still makes my skin crawl. We never found out who they were or what they wanted, but I'll never forget that night, and I'll always wonder how close we came to something much worse. In the winter of 2012, my life took an unexpected turn when my dad got a new job that required us to move 9 hours away from the house I'd grown up in. It was a big change, but my dad, ever practical, had everything planned out. We hired a moving truck for the bulk of our stuff, but instead of sending the car with it, my dad decided we'd drive it down ourselves. The timing couldn't have been worse. I was just learning to drive, and the thought of a 9-hour trip on the highway wasn't exactly thrilling to me. I figured my dad would take the wheel for most of it, but he had other plans. He said this trip would be good practice for me. The plan was simple. My mom and sisters would fly, while my dad and I would drive the car. It didn't sound too bad at first, but what really had me on edge was the weather. The forecast on my phone showed a massive snowstorm that we'd hit about halfway through the trip, a blizzard. And as a new driver, I wasn't exactly eager to test my skills in those conditions. When I brought it up, my dad just waved me off, saying, "It's not as bad as it sounds. Just drive slow and it'll be like normal." We left around 3 p.m., hoping to make it to the new house by midnight. The first few hours were fine, just long stretches of highway and the occasional pit stop. But as the evening crept in, around 8 p.m., so did the storm. The roads went from clear to icy in what felt like seconds. The wind picked up and thick snowflakes started whipping against the windshield, blurring my view. Every muscle in my body tensed up, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight they ached. But my dad, sitting calmly in the passenger seat, didn't seem fazed. He still didn't offer to take over. I kept driving, trying my best to stay calm, but deep down I was terrified. It wasn't long before my worst fear came true. 1 second, I was gripping the wheel, trying to keep us steady on the ice-covered road, and the next, I felt the car slip. My heart lurched as the tires lost traction, and we went skidding off the highway. Everything was happening in slow motion, the car sliding uncontrollably toward a line of trees. I yanked the wheel, praying we wouldn't crash head-on, but the car grazed one of the trunks before coming to a jerky stop. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what had just happened. When we finally stopped, I looked over at my dad, half expecting him to be furious. But to my surprise, he didn't seem angry at all. If anything, he looked relieved. We had dodged a much worse fate, only a slight scratch on the back passenger door to show for it. I could hardly believe it. We both got out to check the damage, the cold air biting at my face as the snow whipped around us. The car was fine. A miracle, really. I started to breathe easier, thinking we'd gotten incredibly lucky. But just as I was about to suggest we get back on the road, a set of bright headlights cut through the blizzard, approaching fast. A car pulled up beside us, its high beams blinding us, and the driver began honking like mad. The man behind the wheel rolled down his window, and I figured he'd ask if we were okay or offer help. But instead of showing concern, he launched into some bizarre small talk, like we were old friends catching up. He didn't mention the fact that we had just slid off the road or that we were stranded in the middle of a snowstorm. He seemed off. My dad wasn't having it. He cut the guy off mid-sentence, asking bluntly, "What do you need?" The man hesitated, then told us that we had dropped something about a mile back, and that it had somehow ended up in his back seat. His words didn't make any sense. Everything was packed away in our trunk, and there was no way anything could have fallen out. I looked to my dad, confused, but before either of us could respond, the man urged again, insisting that I come over and retrieve whatever it was from his car. Something felt wrong. My stomach twisted, and alarm bells were going off in my head, but I figured there was no harm in at least checking. Maybe we had missed something. Against my better judgment, I started walking toward the stranger's car, squinting through the snowstorm. As I reached for the backseat door handle, my dad's voice suddenly cut through the storm, sharp and urgent. "Stop!" he shouted, louder and firmer than I'd ever heard him before. It startled me so badly that I froze, my hand hovering just inches from the handle. My heart was racing, and for a few seconds the only sound was the wind howling around us. My dad never raised his voice like that. It was completely out of character. After what felt like an eternity, I pulled my hand back and stepped away from the stranger's car, not saying a word. I turned and walked back to our car, my dad's eyes following me the entire time. As I climbed into the driver's seat, I glanced at the man again. His face had shifted. His once calm, almost friendly expression had twisted into something dark, his eyes narrowing in frustration, anger even. There was something in his look that made my skin crawl, and I was grateful to be pulling away, even if I didn't fully understand what had just happened. We drove in tense silence for a few miles, the storm still raging outside. My mind was racing, trying to process everything. My dad hadn't said a word since we got back in the car, and I didn't dare ask what had made him yell like that. The entire encounter felt wrong, off. Eventually, my dad broke the silence. His voice was softer now, almost apologetic. "I'm sorry for yelling at you," he said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I couldn't let you open that door." I glanced at him, confused. "Why? What did you see?" He took a deep breath, hesitating for a moment before answering. "While you were walking toward the car, I noticed something," he said, his voice low. "Through the window, I saw the outlines of two men. They were crouched, waiting just behind the door. From the way they were moving, it looked like they were ready to grab you as soon as you opened it." His words sent a cold shiver down my spine. I felt the blood drain from my face as I realized how close I had come to something truly terrible. My dad continued, his voice steady but grim. "I don't know what they were planning, but I wasn't about to find out. I couldn't take the chance." I was in shock, replaying the scene over and over in my head. The man's strange behavior, the insistence that I open his back door. It all made sense now. There was no way we had dropped anything from the car. The whole story had been a lie. a setup. Those men were waiting for me. Whether they planned to rob me, kidnap me, or worse, I didn't want to know. As we continued down the highway, the reality of what had almost happened started to sink in. My dad's instincts had likely saved my life. I glanced over at him, feeling a mix of gratitude and disbelief. He had seen something I hadn't, and he had reacted in time to stop it. Even now, years later, I can't shake the memory of that night. The snowstorm, the stranger's unsettling smile, and the shadows waiting just beyond the door. I still think about what would have happened if I had opened that door. We'll never know for sure what those men had planned, but in my gut, I'm convinced their intentions were anything but good. I'll always be grateful for my dad's quick thinking, and for the lesson that not everyone who offers help has good intentions. This happened when I was 18, right after I finished my first semester of college. I'd made a couple of new friends, Ethan and Lucas, and they came up with the idea of renting a cabin for the weekend. They found it on Airbnb, and since I was done with finals and completely drained, I figured it'd be a good way to unwind. I didn't know much about where we were going, but honestly, I didn't care. I just wanted to get away for a bit. The cabin was about an hour outside of town, buried deep in the woods. The drive there felt long, with the trees growing thicker the further we went, until we finally reached this small, isolated spot right on the edge of a frozen lake. It was the only cabin for miles, surrounded by endless forest and an eerie stillness. For someone like me, who was used to the noise and chaos of the city, the quiet felt unsettling. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just overthinking it. After all, we were here to relax, not get spooked. That first night was uneventful. We unpacked, settled in, and spent the evening hanging out in front of the fireplace. I remember the silence outside was so heavy that every creak of the cabin felt louder than it should have been, like the woods were listening. But nothing weird happened, just a normal night in the middle of nowhere. The second night was when things took a turn. A snowstorm had rolled in during the day, and by the time it was dark, we were snowed in. The wind was howling and snowflakes pounded against the windows like tiny fists. We were stuck. Ethan and I had rooms upstairs, but Lucas was downstairs sleeping on the couch. The storm was so loud I thought it would be impossible to fall asleep, but somehow I managed to drift off. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I was jolted awake by Lucas barging into my room, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. He was talking fast, stumbling over his words, but I caught the part about the motion light outside turning on and off. At first, I was half asleep, brushing it off like it was nothing. Ethan, who had also woken up, said it was probably just the wind or an animal. It's a cabin in the woods during a snowstorm. Stuff like that happens, right? But Lucas shook his head, still out of breath. I thought it was that too, he stammered, until I saw someone. Those words sent a jolt of fear through me. He explained how, when the light flicked on for the third or fourth time, he had finally looked out the window expecting to see a raccoon or a deer. Instead, he saw a shadow, a tall figure, about 6 feet, just standing there by the tree line, watching the cabin. Ethan didn't seem too fazed. He told Lucas it was probably his imagination, the storm playing tricks on him, but Lucas insisted. Something about the way he described it, the way his voice shook, made me believe him. Still, Ethan volunteered to go downstairs and check it out. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified as he left the room, disappearing into the dark hallway. Minutes passed. Then, suddenly, the silence was shattered by a scream, loud and raw, echoing through the cabin. Lucas and I jumped out of bed, running downstairs, our hearts pounding in our chests. We found Ethan on the floor of the living room, pale and shaking, his wide eyes fixed on the large window across the room. He was pointing at it, his hand trembling. We rushed over, looking outside, but there was nothing, just snow swirling in the darkness. Ethan pulled himself up, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't see anything at first. Just the dark. I thought it was the storm, but I leaned closer. There was a face. Someone was right there, standing against the glass. He collapsed back onto the floor, still trembling. "It wasn't the dark I saw," he said, almost to himself. "It was them, just standing there, looking in." I hadn't seen anything myself, but the sheer terror in Ethan's eyes was enough to make me believe every word. My stomach twisted in knots, fear clawing at me. Before I could even process what he said, the lights flickered and then everything went black. The power was out. The cabin plunged into absolute darkness, the storm outside muffling everything but the frantic sound of our breathing. My heart raced, my mind spinning. We were completely cut off. No phone service, no way to call for help. We didn't even have any weapons, just a cabin in the middle of nowhere, 3 terrified kids, and whatever was lurking outside in the storm. We bolted upstairs and barricaded ourselves in one of the bedrooms. The door didn't lock, so we shoved everything we could in front of it, a dresser, a chair, anything, to put a barrier between us and whoever or whatever had been outside. Huddled together in the cold, dark room, we barely spoke, the fear making it impossible to form words. Every sound outside made my heart pound harder. The wind howled, the walls creaked, and every minute dragged by like an eternity. We didn't dare sleep. Every moment I expected to hear footsteps or worse, someone trying to get inside, but nothing came. The night stretched on in unbearable silence. When the first hint of light finally broke through the storm, we didn't waste a second. We took down the barricade and scrambled to gather our things. None of us even talked about it. We all knew we had to get out, fast. The snow was still falling, but Ethan's car was built for rough weather, and we didn't care how bad the roads were. We were leaving. As we stepped outside, we took one last look around. The snow had covered any tracks from the night before, but something caught my eye near the side of the cabin, the fuse box. It had been completely destroyed. Not just broken, someone had taken an axe to it, smashing it repeatedly. We stood there in stunned silence, staring at the damage. That was it. Without another word, we piled into the car and drove away, not even looking back. Later, we tried contacting the Airbnb owner to tell him what had happened, but we never got a response. No explanation, no apology, nothing. I always thought that was strange. I mean, if someone had destroyed your property, wouldn't you want to know? I still don't know who or what was outside the cabin that night or what they wanted. All I know is, I've never felt safe in the woods again.